Hi everyone, it's Lauren. Today I'm going to be reviewing all of the books that I read in the first half of April. As always, all of these books are going to be linked in the description box below if you find them interesting and want to check them out for yourself. And I read some absolute bangers this month, so be prepared. The first book I read was Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli, and this was longlisted for the Booker Prize, for the Women's Prize, and it finally won the Rathbones Folio Award this year. And it's about the topic of undocumented children entering into America. We're following a family who are doing a road trip from New York down to Arizona, I believe, or somewhere on a New Mexico border. My US geography is very bad, apologies. This is a blended family, so the brother and sister are step siblings to each other, and a lot of different topics are covered within this road trip down to this area where a deportation is about to happen. The mother has met a woman in New York whose daughters are trying to enter the country, and she believes they're going to be deported back to Mexico, but they've got lost. So that's one strand of the story where they're trying to find these lost girls or find out what happened to them. The father is also a documentary maker specialising in sound recording, but that he's trying to find out about the Apache Indians at the same time. There's lots of themes of loss and of coming together as a family. Identity, what makes us who we are, our different cultures, and the landscape as well is as much a part of this story as the family themselves, like the desert and the nothingness, the sameness, the history of families and cultures. It's very, very, very impressive as a book. The reading experience for me was a little bit mixed. At first, I really enjoyed her tone, and I thought it was very, very clever. I liked how all of these different themes were being knitted together so seamlessly. But towards the middle, 2/3 of the book, perhaps I started to get a bit bored because this road trip is so long and nothing really seemed to be going anywhere. And I did understand that that was a structural choice, but it did still affect my reading experience, and I did start to kind of lose connection with these characters a little bit until the end, when everything came together in a very different light. And by the end of the book, I was incredibly impressed with what she'd crafted, and I did find myself really caring towards the end. However, I do think it could have done with an edit. I do think at times it was quite pretentious. There are many examples where this mother and father are talking about different songs with their very young children. I think the boy is 10 and the girl is something like 5. And they're discussing song lyrics of all of these different artists like David Bowie and Janis Joplin, and they're going through it and talking about what it meant, and they're talking about language in a way which I felt was just showing off. But that is a trope that I particularly find quite awkward myself. Like, I don't really like it when authors use songs in books, or they have their characters talking very philosophically about songs or using specific lyrics in books, because I feel like that's lazy. I think you should be creating your atmosphere yourself rather than using a Bob Dylan track to soundtrack it. But I think that's just me being pernickety, and it happens a lot in this book. It didn't feel necessary. If it had just been one thing, like they went back to the idea of Space Oddity, that would be fine. But it felt like every chapter there was another song they were talking about, and it just made me think, is this the character being very artistic and thinking she's very clever, or is it the author thinking that she's very clever? It's kind of difficult to know where to draw the line. So I think just a bit of an edit would have made this a very fantastic book, because although I understand that she's using the idea of this very long road trip to kind of explain the nothingness of like these children crossing the desert and it taking a very long time, and I kind of got what she was doing with the structure and I thought it was clever, but that still doesn't mean I enjoyed the fact that it was very long and very boring in places, if you see what I mean. So I think this is an acquired taste, but it's still a very impressive book. Next I read This Is How You Lose Her by Junot Diaz. This was the beginning of my long reading weekend over Easter, which I vlogged, if you haven't seen it, where I tried to read as many short books as possible. This was the first one I picked up, and it is a collection of short stories. What's great about this book is that many of these stories are from the same character's perspective, and it feels like diary entries or somebody looking back on their life, and it's not necessarily chronological, but by the end of it you have a pretty good picture of this one person's life. However, there are other stories in here from different characters' perspectives and unrelated characters to the main story, I suppose you could call it, but they're all linked by themes of immigration, what it's like to be an immigrant in the US. A lot of it takes place in the kind of 80s and 90s, I think, and it's mostly about the Dominican community. There's some stories from the perspective of first generation migrants having to come to the US and work really hard, and there's some from the perspective of either second generation or children of migrants, people who came to the US when they were children, and kind of how that felt coming into a brand new culture. And a lot of the stories are about our narrator just being very, very shitty to women and remembering all of his different girlfriends that he'd had, why it went wrong, what he did that went wrong, whether she was good or not. Like, he's talking about his brother's girlfriends and what they're like. And I really liked the way he writes, the way he mixes in the local slang with also Spanish, and it is very funny, like kind of the way he views his brother or the way he views his girlfriend. Some of the humour is great, even if you're laughing at somebody else's expense. And I think it's great to find a voice where the main character is being a dickhead. And you can understand why he's being like that. He often just doesn't understand the women that he's dating, or they're not very communicative, and he's not very good at communication either, and he's just behaving like a complete twat and then going, oh, I fucked that up, didn't I? I thought this was a really well put together collection, especially because I read it in one go and it did feel like one coherent story a lot of the time. So I would be interested to pick up some more of his work now. The next thing I read was The Cutout of Girl by Bart van Aers, and I absolutely loved this book. I did rave about it in my vlog, but you're going to hear it again because it's brilliant. This is the story of Bart van Aers finding out about his family history. He knows that his grandparents in the Netherlands used to take in Jewish children during the Second World War, and one of those girls, Leen, comes back to live with them after the Second World War because her parents have died. And he also knows that at some point, when they got older, Leen and his grandmother fell out and never spoke ever again. So part of this is about Leen. It's about him reaching out to her, wanting to find out what happened, and also wanting to hear and tell her own story of her life during the war, and also about him finding out his own family's history and how it all mixes together. And what I thought was really fantastic is the way that he mixes biography of just going, Leen did this is where she grew up. There's loads of letters and pictures in here that have survived, which is really amazing. And he also puts that in greater context of what it was like for Jewish people in the Netherlands and how the war affected the Netherlands, really, how equipped everybody was to deal with the Nazi invasion and what the fallout of all of that was. And it's partly his own story, like the story of him emailing Leen and meeting her. It's a story of him going to the Netherlands and visiting all these various places and doing his own research. So he puts himself in the book as well. But that works so fantastically because it is his story, it's his family's story, and he can look at it almost objectively because he's a few generations removed from what happened, but equally he puts his own history and his own emotions into it, and I think it blends absolutely seamlessly. So it's an incredible story. It's great to hear more of Leen's life and how it all fits together, but it's also just so well crafted in terms of non-fiction or biography, and it read like amazingly. I completely couldn't put it down. Next we have another 5-star book. This honestly has been such a good start to the month. I've read so many amazing books, and this was The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This has been on my TBR for a very, very long time because I've heard that it's amazing, and I'm happy to say that it lives up to the hype, and I completely agree with that. This is the musings of an old English country house butler. It starts in 1959 and he's looking back on the golden years of the house when he was with the butler, and he had loads of servants under him, and this takes place between the two world wars, so like 20s and 30s. Very, very Downton Abbey-esque. And the butler, Stevens, his voice is amazing because he's so English, so stiff upper lip, and the way he's explaining things back to you is he's trying to maintain his dignity, and it's very interesting what parts of his own history he puts in and what parts he leaves out, and the way he finds emotions quite unseemly really, and how that needs to be kept within. And what I love about this book is that it really treats you like an English butler. It really carefully and precisely takes you through the story and handles it so politely, and it's very impressive to see how it's been structured and how the story all comes together when you get Stephen's history, but also just what was going on in England at the time, and the demise of the English country house, the idea of the gentlemen and the lords and the people of quality, like the idea that they were just better than everybody else for some reason and had better, more important work to get done in the world. The idea of his master, the lord that he's serving, being kind of involved in European politics and dabbling in places where he's not really qualified to dabble, apart from in view of the fact of him being landed gentry. It's one of those books where at first you can't really see where it's going, so I'm glad that I stuck with it, because in the first few chapters it's really just Stephen's talking about being a butler and how amazing that is, how much he loves being a butler, but also what one should aspire to be a great butler. What is a really great butler? What qualities does he possess? But the rest of the themes and the plot really just creep up on you, and by the end it's almost heartbreaking. It's really cleverly done, and I really enjoyed it, and I loved how English Stephen's tone was. It really made me laugh as well. And finally for this video is What We Lose by Zinzi Clemens. I have read some more books, but I just feel like I read so much in that weekend that I don't want to do them all in one video because I won't have any left over for my end of April video, so we'll finish here. And this is a very interesting book. It's almost a mixture of short stories or flash fiction or poetry, but into one coherent story. Our narrator Tandy is a black woman in the US, although her mother is South African, and she's dealing with many things in the aftermath of her mother's death of cancer. So she's looking back on that, looking back on her relationship with her father, her relationship with her mother, the idea of her becoming a mother herself, also the idea of race and culture and what it's like to be black and the different degrees of colorism that exist within American society as opposed to in South African society, how she's grown up going between the two countries, like how her cousins relate and react to things in a very different way that she does. And it's very clever. It reads really quickly. It's quite short. There's lots of extra things in here, like sometimes there'd just be a photo and then one line on a page, or a graph or something about grief that our characters written in here, and it's in very short sections almost sometimes, like very short chapters. So it reads very quickly, and it's one of those books that when you finish you're like, wow, she touched a lot of angles in that very short book. And the reason it works is because all of these things, all of these aspects of her life and her identity are tied up in her mother, because her mother is who she is, and the idea of, you know, her own relationships is tied up with the idea of her becoming a mother herself, perhaps. So it all these different aspects of her life coming together, and the different races and the different cultures that she has in her life, she has because of her mother. So although it does cover like so many different ideas and topics, it does all really make sense because it has this one grounding feature. And I thought it was really great. I did enjoy it, and it felt like we were going on this journey of grief with Tandy, really sort of going on through this arc and seeing her out the other side. I'd love to know if you've read any of these books. Let me know in the comments, we can have a bit of a chat. Also, actually, if you've read any other books by these authors, I would love to hear what you thought of those, because I don't think I've read anything else by any of these, other than Kazuo Ishiguro actually, although I didn't like Never Let Me Go, which is the only other book of his that I've read. But yeah, give me some recommendations, I'd love to hear it, and then I'll see you in my next video. Bye!